for the win. Garnett on the slam. Oh, using Curry way downtown. Oh, what a shot from Curry.
Doing these style videos of franchises and deep diving their history, I'd say the most fascinating thing I've realized is the front offices are ran by people that are just like you and me in terms of their ability to make mistakes. Except when they do it, the city they're in may not have anything to look forward to for decades at a time concerning their basketball team. After studying the Wolves, I believe this description fits them perfectly. Yet here in 2024, they are on the way up, so in this video, I want to take you all the way back to the Kevin Garnett era and try to help you understand why, after all these years, it's probably the first time in your life this franchise has really been relevant. And if you participate in sports betting, today's sponsor is very relevant for you. Today's video is brought to you by DraftKings. Right now, all new customers can play free for their shot at a share of millions with an initial deposit of just $5. Download the DraftKings app today and sign up using my promo code DOM2K. To play, just draft your roster and the players that you pick will earn points based on their in-game performances. With that first deposit of $5, new customers can play for a share of millions in total prizes. You can check out all that DraftKings has to offer via their app or website. So don't waste any time, download the DraftKings app now and use my promo code DOM2K for your share of millions in total prizes with just a deposit of $5 on the DraftKings app. That's promo code DOM2K only at DraftKings. We're starting our story at the inception of Kevin Garnett, which with 1 year alone is more interesting than the 6 they spent without him after blipping into existence via the expansion. By the way, have you ever heard the truth of how KG became only the 4th professional to come straight out of high school? If you were taught it was due to his poor grades keeping him from college, he claims that ain't the real or full truth. It turns out Garnett was weighing his options when, long story short, he had the privilege of playing a small scrimmage with both Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen. Not only did he hold his own, Isaiah Thomas was also in attendance and put it in his head shortly afterward, he was ready to play in the league now. As intimidating as the proposition was, after seeking out the opinions of other pros, he had no doubt. The young prodigy would declare for the 1995 NBA draft. In a moment which could have completely disrupted history, on draft night, he received a call notifying him that at long last, he'd achieved the scores necessary to attend and play in college, a recent dream of his. Of course, being on the doorstep of millions of dollars and having already gone through the preparation, it was too late. With the 5th pick in the NBA draft, the Minnesota Timberwolves selected the lanky kid who'd be tasked with giving a franchise its first taste of relevance. Halfway through the decade, many had never won more than 29 games, struggling to find any footing as many expansion teams had. He joined a cast featuring some semi-recognizable names, including Christian Laettner, who initially gave him reason to believe the Wolves wouldn't want another big in the first place. As implied, Garnett only started around half the season, not able to do a ton in the way of affecting winning. Speaking of which, during a match with the soon-to-be record-setting Bulls, he was already setting the tone and making his mark in a way future generations would relish. Unfortunately, the player he'd antagonized on this specific night was Michael Jordan, who went on to sit up in his chair after hearing KG's comments and pack his squad up without really breaking a sweat. It became one of 56 losses during 1996, sending Minnesota back to the lottery with, once again, the 5th overall pick. Talented class, as I'm sure you're aware, featuring name after name who'd go on to shape the next era of hoops. One of such was sharpshooter Ray Allen, who would be selected only for the purposes of sending him directly to Milwaukee in exchange for the prize they were really after. Stephon Marbury and Garnett had a pre-existing relationship from their high school days. Meanwhile, the team was already thirsty for a point guard to lead the future, especially considering the success guard-big duos had put forth already. Thus, headed into 97, the city would enjoy 40 wins and at long last, a discernible direction. Marbury finished 2nd in Rookie of the Year voting, big man Tom Gugliotta made his first and only All-Star appearance, while Ticket showed large improvement and earned his first All-Star selection via being a replacement player. While the foundation appeared to be in place, it was far too early to be discussing any real playoff goals. They'd be swept by the veteran Houston Rockets in round 1. The next few years of this saga are indicative of the luck Minnesota would have going forward. When your franchise isn't located in one of the markets who are just gifted stars no matter how many mishaps you've made, the biggest challenge you face is getting help and maximizing the star you were lucky enough to be granted in the draft. With the core in place, they only needed time, some smart moves, and development. The one thing they didn't have was time. The three wouldn't even get a real chance at blossoming when in January of '98, Gugliotta was lost for the remainder of the season with ankle surgery at a moment when he was the unit's leading scorer. With Gary Payton being able to muster up enough to send them packing in round 1 again, the Garnett-Marbury duo was essentially out of chances quicker than anyone could blink. There were already characters in the league looking at KG sideways because he'd foregone college and successfully made the jump. A whole new layer was added when he signed a 6-year, $126 million contract, the richest in history at the time. The 21-year-old shaking the game up so violently especially didn't sit well with the owners, who were now headed into lockout negotiations looking to place limits on max player salaries and prevent any other young players from enjoying something similar. One of the young players who'd have loved to see such big money was none other than Stephon Marbury, who after 2 years of solid development had seen enough. He was finished here. Steph hadn't been an all-star, no Team USA selection, and now was being offered only $71 million by the front office, which, by the way, was the max they could give up at the time. Wanting more money and a larger spotlight, Marbury made his standing clear. Trade me or I'm going to Chicago. These were the Bulls in year 1 of the post-Jordan era, so in other words, terrible. That's just how serious he was about making his own way. With very little options, Kevin McHale obliged, sending him to New Jersey in exchange for point guard Terrell Brandon, another guy, and picks. Adding insult, before the season kicked off, Tom Gugliotta took less money to join the Suns, citing how he wanted to find the right fit and city even if it meant less for him. Yeah, you're not crazy. Essentially by Garnett's 4th year, he'd become a household name, immediately helped create a formidable core, and was left for dead all before the year 2000. Due to the misfortune, the next 4 seasons would more or less be slightly different cuts of the same movie. They weren't a bad team. The talent around Garnett simply couldn't live up to the possibilities it once possessed. In an effort to alleviate said issue, the front office all but doomed themselves when, before the lockout season, they acquired forward Joe Smith on a 1-year, $1.75 million contract, a number suspiciously below his market value. For perspective, he turned down an $80 million extension with Golden State only a couple of years prior. The backdoor arrangement was basically as follows. Smith would sign cheap deals for a few years to start, then once Minnesota had his bird right, he'd be rewarded with a much bigger deal. As McHale would later remark, multiple teams in the league do this, they're just better at hiding it. The Wolves would have gotten away with it too, if not for a sports agent split which triggered a lawsuit bringing obscure documents to the forefront. It was there the league was alerted to the illegal agreement, prompting an investigation, then punishment. Before the start of the 2000 season, the org would be fined $3.5 million while having to forfeit first-round draft picks for the next 5 years. Smith's contracts were voided, while owner Glenn Taylor was suspended for a year and Kevin McHale took a leave of absence. If you're doing the math, Minnesota's flexibility for the next phase of the Garnett era had been cooked, very shortly after their future core had been cooked. Doesn't sound bad enough? In May of 2000, Garnett's good friend and teammate Malik Sealy would tragically pass after being struck by a drunk driver. He'd been one of the first members of the team to make KG feel welcome. To this day, his number 2 remains the only retired jersey in Wolves history. More on that later. In a move hoped to stop the bleeding, Chauncey Billups would join the club, who not only had potential as a guard, but was already a friend to Garnett, and someone who'd help keep him grounded through the tragedy which never went away in his head. At the time Billups tagged along, the franchise had just achieved its first 50-win season where Terrell Brandon proved to be a steady hand at the point, on top of Wally Szczerbiak having an immediate impact. Brandon went down with a nasty knee injury during 2001, forcing Big Shot to the starting role where he did not disappoint. In the round 1 battle against Dallas, he averaged an efficient 22-5-5, so although they'd been swept, perhaps he'd be the answer to the void an old and now possibly critically injured Terrell Brandon would leave. Perhaps not. Sometimes an older player sees a young gun coming for a spot and they hate. They see them as competition. They don't lend a helping hand for the pup to find his way around the association. That was not the relationship these two shared. Terrell mentored him, gave him all the tools he needed to become a better point guard and help the team, especially in wake of his absence. With Chauncey set to hit free agency in the summer, Brandon even offered to move to the bench permanently and continue to let the future blossom. It was a no-go. The front office was committed to the former All-Star for the future, and not the bigger, younger guard who was the same age as their franchise cornerstone. Dragging their feet on an offer which ended up being less than Detroit's, Schott took his talents to a team who appeared to be higher on the prospect of letting him spread his wings. Okay, just to recap where we are by 2002, this team had now been eliminated in the first round for 5 straight years. They traded Ray Allen on draft night for a future star point guard who gave them no more than a couple of seasons before bolting. Their other star in Gugliotta went his own way. They stuck their necks all the way out for Joe fucking Smith, costing them significant assets for the future. Then sat by as Chauncey Billups walked away in favor of their injured veteran point guard who, by the way, never played another game in the NBA. In 2002, Wally Szczerbiak had increased his offensive output, landing the first and only All-Star appearance of his career. By retaining Billups, they'd have somehow survived and possibly rebuilt the potential in the core involving Marbury. Oh, also on the Joe Smith front, after going to Detroit for a year due to the voided deal, he then came back in 2002 on $34 million for 6 years. To make it all clear, the young expansion franchise had posted an absolute masterclass in wasting the clock of an all-time great, who at this time had clearly become a top player in the league. He was unique, a big who could put the ball on the floor, play in the post, give ferocious effort on D, soak up all the knowledge he could from another all-time great in Kevin McHale. Honestly, if this had been the later era, Ticket would have probably already taken his talents elsewhere. Instead, he went on to sign a veteran extension worth $100 million in October of 2003, and I'm sure you can guess why. By 2004, Garnett had helped produce 3 50-win campaigns and 7 competitive ones. He'd also unfortunately oversaw a record-setting 7th straight year of first-round exits. With nothing in the way of playoff success going on to 27 years old, his hand would possibly be forced. Enter Sam Cassell, who'd be acquired for the infamous Joe Smith and Anthony Peeler, another Garnett associate and guard who'd bring sorely needed offensive juice beside him. Enter veteran star forward Latrell Sprewell, who'd been to an NBA Finals and could further relieve pressure. They'd take him back in a 4-team deal involving Terrell Brandon, who they very much could have just let fade off in favor of Chauncey. All spilled milk though. The Wolves had managed to survive numerous hardships, bad decisions, fumbles, and now had what outlets were calling the Big Three. Crazy, right? In every Big Three convo you've ever heard, I know the 04 Wolves haven't popped up yet. KG claims it was the first time he'd actually heard the term. The 04 edition would set a franchise record 58 wins, nab the first seed in a ridiculous conference, see Sam Cassell make his first All-Star team, while Kevin Garnett took home MVP, averaging 24 and 14 with 2 blocks and 50% from the field. As a young, scrawny LeBron James put it, he was the best player in the league. Now to finally put it all together in the playoffs. The playoffs where during round 1, Wally Szczerbiak would crack 3 vertebrae in his back, an injury expected to sideline him for the rest of the year after a regular season of dealing with foot injuries. Hard to say this didn't damper their potential a bit, especially when you consider Sam Cassell sustaining an avulsion fracture during Game 7 of round 2 after an iconic celebration. True, the Wolves had barely survived the often competitive Kings and one of Garnett's idols in Chris Webber, only they were now diving headfirst into a conference final showdown with the Dynasty Lakers, now featuring a Big Four without their star point guard being able to participate in every game, thus leaning into what they had left, which included a Wally Szczerbiak who somehow made it back to game action. In a year that could have produced Cinderella-style results, the Lakers as usual crashed the party, ending their most successful bid to date in 6. From there, the downfall was quick and swift. Not even a year removed from Garnett trusting them enough to lease his future prematurely. To start, both Latrell and Cassell fell off. They were in their mid-30s, but the year-to-year regression was a lot to stomach, especially knowing they were the pieces the front office trusted to take them all the way. Sam only managed 59 games dealing with a bum hamstring, leading to a trend where 10 different players started 14 games or more, very much contributing to the downfall in their defense that helped them to elite status in 2004. Flip Saunders was fired as the team sat at just 26 and 25, with Kevin McHale stepping down from the front office to lead them back in the right direction. Finishing the season, they'd see a 14-game reduction from their record-setting year, going 44 and 38 to miss the playoffs by a single game. Oh, it only got worse from there. Sprewell retired over summer, then they traded Sam, who was in the final years of his deal. Due to that circumstance, they even attached a first-round pick to entice the Clippers to take him in exchange for younger guard Marko Jaric. In the 05 draft, Minnesota would select Rashad McCants at pick 14, who was out of the league by age 24. Who was still on the board, you ask? Danny Granger, who showed his future potential by year 2. While Sam Cassell was busy leading LA, who'd come within a possession of the conference finals, the Wolves used another draft pick to get off of Wally Szczerbiak through trade. In the midst of complete turmoil, they fell all the way to 14th in the West at only 33 wins. Yes, in 2 measly seasons, many watched another core disintegrate in the middle of KG's prime, with very little in the way of opportunity to climb back. 2005 would prove to be their last winning season for what would feel like an eternity. This all could have been remedied on draft night 06, which in hindsight was probably their last chance to salvage the Garnett era. With the 6th pick in the draft, the Wolves selected Brandon Roy, then promptly shipped him off to Portland in a deal involving Randy Foye. Good grief, man. Hindsight is 2020. We've got the benefit of knowing Roy would be an elite talent for 3 or 4 years. At the time, Foye was viewed as the safer pick and was more popular in general. Also consider, Roy had a documented knee issue, raising the question of how long you'd be able to depend on him as the cornerstone. So, fair game, I guess. Regardless, it doesn't appear like McHale ever had plans to take or keep Roy. There's reports of a deal where they were going to trade with the Rockets for Foye, only Portland beat them to the punch, meaning Minnesota had to deal with them instead. In an alternate universe where they just roll with the Rookie of the Year, he likely gives the organization and Garnett confidence they'll eventually be able to win. The way it shook out, Foye would look like a role player as Ticket took a cast of Ricky Davis, Mark Blount, Trenton Hassel, and Mike James to 32 wins, 1 less than the previous year. It was done. What intrigues me the most about this era was Garnett's tolerance, and how he absolutely refused to ever request a trade or even look elsewhere. The man loved the city who took a chance on him, was extremely loyal, and badly wanted to reward said trust with a title. For the modern star, the events of 2005 and 6 would have been enough for guys to plant the seeds of their next move. Yet, here the man was having to be convinced it was time to go 3 years after the most success he'd ever seen. Characters such as former teammate Chauncey Billups and Antoine Walker had to put it in his ear that it was time to go elsewhere and win one. Funny enough, Billups, who was 2 years removed from a title and still contending, wasn't trying to recruit him to Detroit. He told him it was time to let Boston complete the deal. His good friend Paul Pierce awaited, only KG wouldn't sign off on the trade and agreed to be there long term. Phoenix jumped in the sweepstakes, only to be shunned when it became clear they'd have to give up guys Garnett actually wanted to play with. Then there was his good friend Kobe Bean Bryant, or Cobean as Garnett called him. When Kobe was planning to make the jump from high school, he sought out Garnett's advice and the relationship took off from there. Which makes it weird how in summer 07, when teams were getting ready to wheel and deal, he couldn't get a hold of Bryant, who was in China doing some tour. Still, Garnett alleges he called again and again and again, all summer trying to make the connection and discuss a possible future together. A future both stars needed with their current teams having fallen all the way off. No answer. KG took that as an answer. Once Boston nabbed Ray Allen, the advice of his friends finally got through. He would accept the trade and commit to the new Big Three in Beantown. The mega deal brought back Al Jefferson, Gerald Green, Sebastian Telfair, Ryan Gomes, with a future first rounder and the very same pick they'd recently attached to Wally Szczerbiak. Minnesota tragically waved goodbye to the hope of its franchise over the past 12 years, now in full rebuild mode to hopefully chart a new path forward. Draft pick misses, horrible managing of contracts, general misfortune, it all led to this day where, unlike Miami, they could never put it all together as a lowly expansion team. What now? Al Jefferson showed potential as a formidable franchise big, which is why McHale had been so adamant about kicking off the new era under him. With the rest of the roster being decorated by no names or younger guys, a predictable 22-win outing ensued, earning them the 3rd pick in a talented draft. At this part, you could laugh at the fact they selected OJ Mayo right before Russell Westbrook, but it surprisingly represented one of their few good decisions as they sent him to Memphis in exchange for Kevin Love, a talented big to slot next to Al Jefferson. Although another massive losing season followed, something was starting to take shape ahead of the 09 draft. 2 strong developing bigs, a decent guard in Randy Foye, and most importantly for this stage, draft picks. The 24 wins granted them the 6th pick for 09. They already possessed both the 18th and 28th picks from sending Ricky Davis to the Heat in 07 and one of the 2 picks they got back in the Garnett deal. One day before the draft, they sent Randy Foye and Mike Miller to Washington for the 5th pick. A rebuilding team with the fringe makings of a core now had 4 shots at a dream on draft night. Pretty hard to mess up, right? With the 5th pick in the 2009 NBA draft, the Minnesota Timberwolves selected point guard Ricky Rubio, who at some points in the year appeared to be the best prospect available. Using the very next pick, they selected Johnny Flynn, another point guard to deal with the fact they had basically shown up to that night without one. At 18, they took another, picking up Ty Lawson, who they traded for a future first round pick, then finished up by grabbing Wayne Ellington at the end of the first. Know who they didn't grab? Steph Curry, DeMar DeRozan. Yeah, no, the painful one is Steph, because they took 2 point guards directly in front of him. Hindsight helps us know this was a generational fumble, yet in 09 it was simply a choice a lot of execs probably would have made. Trust, if something this painful was going to happen to anybody, it was going to be the Wolves. Okay, and maybe the Clippers. Seeing as Rubio wouldn't actually come to the league for a bit, Flynn got a test drive to push it in the right direction. You know, he wasn't half bad. 14 points a game with nearly 5 assists, athletic, and qualified for all-rookie second team. 15 wins sucked, sure, yet it did provide them another chance to hit in the draft. Meanwhile, Kevin Love continued to improve, experimenting with the 3-ball in his sophomore season. In typical Wolf luck, however, Flynn would have to undergo the knife over summer for a hip surgery. More on this later. Another high pick in the draft was okay, but the moves management made in the years prior suggested they wanted to be in position to pick off someone big during 2010 free agency. Of course, the question you'd be asking by now is, who the hell goes to Minnesota in free agency? About the only motion you can find is David Lee giving them a meeting. Anyways, in the draft where most smaller markets make or break their futures, they selected older forward Wesley Johnson at pick 4, right in front of DeMarcus Cousins. They already had Big Al, you say? In July, they sent him to Utah in effort to let Kevin Love fully blossom, while also becoming a more up-tempo team. Al gave them solid years. Still, Kurt Rambis disliked playing the two together on offense, and the pairing wasn't much better to look at on D. Consider it with the fact Jefferson and the front office agreed they remained years away from serious hoops, and they made a mutual agreement to get him on a playoff team where they'd take picks back while opening up cap flexibility to get something next to Love sooner than later. In short, they weren't trading one big just to pick up another. Still sucks to imagine they then missed Hayward and Paul George, both of whom would have been acceptable co-stars and vastly outpaced Wesley Johnson's career. If you wanted to keep track, here are some of the names they'd missed by 2010, all of which would have lit the path for a brighter future. The guy they picked in front of Curry? Immediate regression after the hip operation, as his production fell off a cliff during year 2, and his career more or less ended right then and there. He'd be traded next season mostly for picks. Kevin Love, however, did fully spread his wings, turning into a double-double machine and posting the first 30-30 game since Moses Malone in 1982. There's only been one other in the 14 years since. Continuing to expand his range, he was now an all-star in year 3, averaging 15 rebounds and doing more than he gets credit for to help change what was expected from big men. The only thing he needed now was the consistent second piece on the same timeline the front office had proven unable to find for over a decade now. With Flynn going the other direction, next in line would be Wesley Johnson, who was painfully far behind the expectations of a 4th pick. Third stop would be their ace in the hole. On June 1st, Ricky Rubio had reached an agreement to leave Spain for the NBA, a hot button issue previously making it unknown whether he'd play for the Timberwolves. Good timing too, they needed him in the worst way. Kyrie Irving and Derrick Williams were the consensus 1 and 2 picks of the 2011 draft. Landing the 2nd pick meant they wouldn't be able to nab Irving and avoid the pressures of the Rubio drama altogether. They would, however, be able to do what any team would have done: select the oddly sized, athletic power forward to continue building. Unfortunately, it turned out to be another case of misplaced trust, as he followed right in the footsteps of average forward set by Wesley Johnson. No matter, Ricky Rubio was the future. The 2012 Timberwolves are one of those obscure teams I simply never let go of, cause I was there and can clearly remember the signs of life from a franchise who'd mostly been a joke in my time as a fan. Through 41 games played, Rubio would post a near double-double, proving to be the perfect fit and a fantastic floor general for the talent they did have. By March 9th, the record sat at 21-20, which may not seem like much unless you consider how it was on pace to be the most games they'd won since Garnett disappeared in 07. Due to the lockout, it was a 66-game campaign, but with 25 games left, they were going to smoke their previous records. No, they weren't. On March 9th, during a play against Kobe Bryant, Rubio went down with what was later revealed as a torn ACL. They drafted multiple duds, waited years for him to make his debut, and finally had grabbed just a crumb of success after years of suffering. This was the reward. By the end of the year in late April, the team would finish at 26-40. They won 5 games in Rubio's absence. Total darkness. How can you even think about getting ahead when nobody willingly signs with your franchise, a draft pick works out every once in a blue moon, and injuries take whatever's left? Speaking of which, although Rubio would return in 2013 to play a majority of the year, Kevin Love would then be limited to 18 games after dealing with a fracture sustained to his shooting hand during a workout. He had also broken his hand during his sophomore season, so injuries were silently becoming a trend. Okay, cool, so back to the lottery you go. With the 9th pick, many selected Trey Burke, sending him to Utah for Gorgie Deng and Shabazz Muhammad, also selecting Andre Roberson later in the round before trading him away. The Love era was getting a bit restless. Headed into year 6, the franchise was in nearly the exact same spot they'd been in when they drafted him. Meanwhile, his name was beginning to show up in dream scenarios for teams and stars he could be useful with. The city was in need of a big showing at this pivotal point, and they only had halfway decent names around him to make it happen. A big in Nikola Pekovic, who'd missed plenty of games, older Kevin Martin, Corey Brewer, and recent draftees who had nothing to add. In the previous offseason, Wesley Johnson was moved to Phoenix for 3 second-rounders. They also attached a future first-rounder to get off of him. As it was clear Derek Williams was frustrated and wouldn't fit, he too was shipped out for more defense. Bro was the highest draft pick in franchise history, gone after 2 years. Love took another jump, nearly helping achieve a 500 record, which meant absolutely nothing in the mid-2010s West. The 40-42 mark would have gotten them 8th in the East. Safe to say the writing was on the wall. Around this time, LeBron James was rumored to be on the move again, possibly headed back to Cleveland. The franchise had amassed Kyrie Irving and an extremely timely, valuable first overall pick in a draft featuring a couple guys slated to be Hall of Fame talents. Minnesota would have to select outside the top 10 finally, and in a cruel twist of events, finally hit on a pick, grabbing Zach LaVine from UCLA. An athletic shooting guard with loads of potential, they had a shot at going ahead with another full youth movement. The Kevin Love trade topic. There were many teams thirsty for the services of what appeared to be a superstar big. The most solid offer we know of? Golden State got in the mix, dangling David Lee, a first-round pick or Harrison Barnes, and Klay Thompson. Only Jerry West threatened to resign from the franchise if the deal materialized, citing how Klay was the perfect player for Steph. Genius. On August 23, 2014, the Cavaliers sent Andrew Wiggins, Anthony Bennett, and Thaddeus Young to the Wolves for Kevin Love in a 3-team deal. Before anyone could even blink, Minnesota was on their 3rd attempted build since existing, with 7 first-round exits and numerous playoff misses to show for. Perhaps the 3rd try would be a charm? 66 losses in 2015 were necessary and expected. 25 players suited up, as they practically rolled the ball out and said, go make something of yourselves, this year isn't important. They'd already gotten the assurance Wiggs wasn't a bust, while LaVine showed flashes of promise. If you're unsure how hard the Wiggins hype was a decade ago, him going up against Kobe was a huge deal. It was marketed, he was expected to be the protege. Kobe even gave quotes after the game acknowledging he had what it took. Becoming the first rookie of the year in franchise history, the future was somewhat bright. They just had to get over the same hurdle which plagued them since inception. At long last, the struggling business finally landed a first overall pick organically, receiving total autonomy of a class expected to produce multiple stars. What would fit better on a team with blossoming perimeter guys than a multi-skilled big? Enter Karl Anthony Towns, who in hindsight may be the most NBA ready talent they picked up so far. To sweeten it all, look who came home. At the end of 2015, the city opened its doors for its hero in Kevin Garnett, who'd now taken multiple stops and become an NBA champion. Although he was on his last leg, there was a ton he could pass down to what was poised to become a talented trio. Hopes were specifically high about his work with KAT. The big shot 34% from 3 out the gates, averaged 18 and 11 on the season, while becoming the second Wolf ever to take home Rookie of the Year honors. Wiggs continued his upward trajectory, while LaVine grew into his. Though, when your 3 best players are all 20 and the rest of the roster hasn't really been completely fleshed out, 29 wins isn't too surprising. Still, better days had to finally be around the corner. Garnett hoped as much, giving us 1 more season, finishing it with the franchise he often had a complicated relationship with. An early season dunk over Blake Griffin gave us all warm memories of the past, when the game was his. It was sad and beautiful, if that makes sense. He looked a little older, didn't move the same, and surely was a bit awkward in the new Wolves threads considering he was a relic of the past. Ticket missed his success here via a front office who a decade later was still trying to clear these same hurdles. No matter, his love and devotion still remained clear. He'd leave the torch with the young pups, hoping they one day could finish what he started. As a matter of fact, he was supposed to oversee it. Allegedly, he had business in place with owner Glenn Taylor to become a minority owner. Then Garnett details how once Flip Saunders died, those talks went out the window. The whole ordeal soured his relationship with ownership, where you'll notice to this day his jersey remains noticeably absent from the rafters. As long as Taylor is involved, it won't be a thing. Super bad look for the organization. It's even worse considering Glenn was finally about to sell the team and has recently backed out of the deal. More on that later. Bring on another top 5 pick. Looking at a decent core, Minnesota selected Chris Dunn at 5, once again as anyone in their shoes would have done. No pun intended. Look, I've even got a tweet from around the time where I clearly thought they figured it all out. I also wasn't as sharp as I am today about their franchise. Dunn mostly played from the bench, tracking far below 5th pick numbers as the team posted another losing season, adding now to a long and painful trend of playoff misses since 2004. For those wondering, Dunn was selected 2 picks in front of Jamal Murray. After another run with no progress record-wise, the Wolves had seen enough. How many times by now had they sat idly by waiting for the right combo of draft picks to raise the tides? Landing the 7th pick in 2017, they used it to take Lauri Markkanen and quickly package him with Zach LaVine for Jimmy Butler, the 3-time All-Star who developed at an awkward time in Chicago. KAT was clearly all-star talent, and they had no intentions of wasting it for a 3rd time. The thing about Butler was he didn't just bring his talent, you weren't gonna coexist with him if you weren't serious about winning. They'd also acquired some vets like Jamal Crawford, and towards the very end got a hold of Derrick Rose. Topped off with Coach Thibodeau, the conglomerate achieved 47 wins, making it their most coherent and successful outing in 14 years. KAT made his first All-Star team alongside Jimmy, also earning All-NBA 3rd team. While the mark only cleared them for 8th in the West, most were just happy to see their team being taken seriously again. Only problem was, did Jimmy take the team seriously? Wiggins, who Butler considered the most God-gifted player amongst them, fell well short of previous hopes in his first playoff series, and hadn't shown a ton of upwards motion since inking his huge extension. Down low, Towns was also a shell of his regular season self, which was especially unfortunate given his personal relationship with Butler. Knowing contract talks were around the corner, Top Dog decided to slightly turn up the heat to see who was really made for it by training camp. Entering practice, he personally requested to play with the less talented players, backups, G League guys, just not the starters. As the story goes, he led them to wins, specifically taking aim at KAT and stealing the ball from him multiple times. Jeff Teague says the pairing disliked each other. When it was said and done, Jimmy made sure the entire gym could hear how he wanted to be paid, and that he thought the guys on the floor were incapable of winning without him. Bro had gone as far as to cut the Timberwolves logos out of the clothes he was wearing. Before the rest of the squad could even leave practice, Buckets was doing an interview with Rachel Nichols, just about telling everything which had gone down shortly before. All this on the heels of his desire to be traded, which originally held him out of training camp. His point was clear. On November 10th, the loud personality was sent to Philly for Dario Saric, Robert Covington, Jared Bayless, and a 2nd round pick. What? How did they manage to trade for an all-star, go to the playoffs for the first time in over a decade, only to lose him just as fast? Back to square one. They were already struggling with Butler for the small bit of 2019 he remained present, so I'm not sure anyone expected bright results moving forward. I mean, it was kinda cool seeing Derrick Rose prove he still had talent, especially on the heels of the emotional random 50-point outing. It just didn't help peace of mind going forward. What was the move now? 5 years in, Wiggs was starting to fall behind schedule, as he'd yet to regain his form from the pre-Butler days. Covington barely saw any games, hampered by knee issues, and nothing else recently or from the past had been working out or moving the unit in a better direction. No Butler, no postseason. 36 wins. Back to the draft board. With pick 11, Cameron Johnson was selected and traded alongside Saric for Jarrett Culver. Maybe it's not extremely notable given his injury history, but Tyler Hero did get picked up shortly after. Not the end of the world anyways. After going undrafted, LSU's Naz Reid would sign a 2-way contract in July, waiting in the shadows for his moment, which would be bigger than anyone could have imagined. Headed for the turn of a decade, it was time to deal with reality. The 2010s started with their development of Love, who was meant to lead the new era. Then after years of falling grossly short, they switched out halfway through to hopefully do the same with Wiggs. In October 2017, he signed a 5-year, $146 million contract extension to become the next big thing for the franchise. Would it cost him? He had to promise owner Glenn Taylor he'd work really hard to become a better player. Yeah. In the season since, he'd not only regressed in many areas, prompting some pretty nasty articles, his deal value was partly to blame as to why Butler left. What aging star veteran wanted to sit around as a young player hogging cap space became one of the league's worst contracts? Coming up to 2020, the squeeze was being felt, and there hadn't been a single indicator the pairing with Towns was going to pay off. Near the deadline, the Wolves would dump Wiggins off to Golden State, attached to a protected 2021 first-round pick and a 21 second-rounder for D'Angelo Russell, Jacob Evans, and Omari Spellman. The situation was right for a Russell in need of change and a front office in need of exiting a souring deal. Right on cue, the league would shut down due to COVID, ending another miserable outing. The draft at this point was consistently hit or miss. They were either welcoming a perennial star or a guy who'd play there for 3 years max before being swapped out. Most recently, Wolves brass felt they'd made a mistake trading for Jarrett Culver, one of many unremarkable names to walk through the revolving door. Due to the trauma, you can look back and find just how hard their new first overall pick was being shopped. There's even a recent tweet from Trae Young suggesting a deal may have shipped it to Atlanta. They shook every tree, ultimately settling on selecting Anthony Edwards out of Georgia, who immediately had his commitment to basketball questioned after an interview. He went on to say how if he got drafted to the NFL, he'd give up basketball tomorrow. Quote, "You can do anything on the field. You can spike the ball, you can dance, you can do all type of disrespectful stuff. In the NBA, you can't do any of that. You'll get fined." Ha!
Ooh, they were lucky that wasn't turned over. Anthony Edwards, that time he does finish.
A sign of things to come? Absolutely. On the surface, they were saying Minnie just landed another dud. Sure, he's probably talented, but how much does he actually care about hoop? Definitely not enough to draw Michael Jordan comparisons in a few short seasons. Yet, from the outset, they'd clearly hit their target, immediately thanking their lucky stars they hadn't sent the pick away. On top of him showing potential as a scorer in year 1, Nasri did the very same, shooting 35% from 3 as a mobile 6'9" big. In November, GM Gerson Rosas shipped off James Johnson and the 17th pick to OKC for lanky forward Jaden McDaniels, whose physical tools were right for the 3-and-D role. At the end of the 2020 campaign, they'd also acquired more size than Jared Vanderbilt as part of a 4-team deal. Basically, yeah, sure, they flatlined at 23 wins. This time with the knowledge help was on the way. Although KAT had only qualified for 2 All-Stars, he continued to post star numbers despite experiencing immeasurable loss during COVID. A note I feel nobody remembers when discussing him. By 2022, you could start to see a possible come-up. Towns remained the leading scorer, and Ant was already doing the thing Wiggins had promised years ago: get better. D'Angelo Russell was holding steady as PG, McDaniels showed flashes, and a slightly obscure offseason acquisition in Patrick Beverley would go on to make his stamp. The Wolves finished with 46 wins, good enough for 7th seed where, due to the new rules, playing into the position would be necessary. They did so, producing one of the greatest NBA memes of the 2020s. At long last, they'd made the playoffs twice in a span of 10 years. Monumental for a group mainly known for just existing. That ain't all though. Many didn't just make the playoffs, they went toe-to-toe with another young team who happened to seed much higher. Wolves Grizzlies was entertaining because despite the discrepancy in seeding, if you'd watched their regular season matchups, you knew. Minnesota absolutely had a game plan to be competitive and win the series. It would all come down to execution, which for stretches neither team was capable of. Seriously, it felt like watching 2 groups trying to lose on purpose. Back and forth, back and forth. The young Wolves would blow multiple 20-point leads in the same game, overall just collapsing in moments where they had Memphis exactly where they wanted. In the end, the mistakes became insurmountable, as the Grizz escaped in 6. There were no mistakes though. Ant had proven in postseason number 1 that he could thrive in the environment, which felt especially important considering KAT was in year 7 with only 1 playoff appearance to his all-star name, a very dreadful one at that. This outing against Memphis was better. We still weren't getting number 1 vibes from him. He spent the regular seasons being really good, really talented, just missing something. His battles with other bigs were fascinating. He'd made a name for himself, only to take up the same position 2 other bigs before him occupied. His personality also wasn't convincing. The sound bites we'd get from him, the mannerisms, it all did nothing to convince fan bases of a number 1. Perhaps he wasn't going to be the leader of a grown-up Wolves unit, and they'd found the man who would. Going toe-to-toe with the other up-and-coming squad on the biggest stage was certainly evidence they were on the right trail. Better not waste it this time, right? In late May of 2022, the Wolves hired executive Tim Connolly as he left president of basketball operations in Denver. The creation he oversaw hadn't been healthy, but no doubt had the potential to win a championship once the finished product saw the floor. Taking his talents north, he intended to do the same with operations, who would only produce 3 playoff appearances in almost 20 years. On July 6, 2022, he'd get to work sending Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverley, Leandro Balmaro, Walker Kessler, Jared Vanderbilt, 4 first-round picks and a pick swap to Utah in exchange for Rudy Gobert. I almost don't even know where to start about this deal, considering where we are today. At the time, it was one of the most harshly judged moves I can remember. Not only because they just mortgaged the future on a player nobody really liked or trusted, they did so at a time where the world was trying to see a Durant trade. The question became, if Rudy fucking Gobert is going for 1 million acres and a mule, what could anybody possibly offer for KD? The market was in total disarray now. Also, there were questions for the franchise. Questions like, what exactly is your plan here? 2 7-footers, one seems offensively inept and the other is still trying to reach his superstar potential. What about the spacing for a budding star and Ant? Speaking of which, in one of his many funny moments, had once upon a time told us how Rudy Gobert didn't put fear in no one's heart. Insane comment to be floating around about the guy your championship hopes now hinged on. Even crazier, this unit was the unit going forward. It would become so expensive to employ this lineup, you wouldn't really be able to get out of it without making some drastic moves if matters went sideways. So although it was a young team, they were totally strapped into the present now, and in the modern NBA would need to figure it out as quickly as possible. 2023 would do little to inspire confidence in the new direction, as they were honestly just never healthy enough to do the gelling necessary to excel. KAT would appear in 29 games, while D'Lo got 54 before being packaged in a deal to retrieve a steadier hand in Mike Conley. The importance? A lineup of McDaniels, Ant, Russ, KAT, and Gobert had been ranked the worst lineup of 2022. Yeah, there's some important factors like how many games those 5 even got to play together. Still, shock value. Meanwhile, Conley would end up contributing to the best lineup in a very short time period. Stumbling through excessive injuries, the young group would again persevere to qualify as a seed, meeting the finally healthy Denver Nuggets in round 1. No one expected them to win. I also don't think anyone expected the fight they showed. Sure, they went down 3-0, which needs some context. J-Mac broke his hand in early April after punching a wall, ensuring his team would be without a top defender in the league as they faced the future champs. Naz Reid broke his wrist only slightly earlier, sidelining him. The consequence? Ant could average 32 points, his team could show all the fight in the world when the series was practically over, there would just be zero room for an upset. It did however leave an impression. Many had been endlessly clowned for the Gobert deal. This was the guy you pushed all your chips in for? Yet Denver fans were the first ones to see it. Guys, hang on, they're actually really good and might have caused a serious issue if they weren't missing 2 rotation players. It was a fun thought, only history has many teams who showed signs of life in the playoffs only to never fully materialize. How about they start with putting a healthy season together? Quiet as kept, Karl Towns was giving off injury-prone vibes at the worst time. The trend would continue, except the 2024 Wolves had it all figured out. Ant continued his linear progression, including transforming his defense, now blipping on MVP ballots and becoming one of the more bombastic personalities in the league. Rudy Gobert handed down another decoy campaign, helping Minnesota to the best defense in the league. Oh, it wasn't just him though. Naz Reid, versatile and mobile at 6'9" on both ends of the floor. J-Mac, perimeter length. Na, who they'd also acquired with Conley, perimeter length. The starting 5, best lineup in the league. Right in front of our eyes, the long-standing laughingstock had a future MVP talent, possibly the best shooting big in history, the decoy, and the 6th man of the year, all under a veteran point guard hungry to finally win. Even with KAT sidelined for much of the year, they finished only a game out of first seed, hoping to prove this thing was ready to go now, not in a few years. Their first test would be a Phoenix Suns team who'd given off mixed vibes down the stretch. The roster was clearly deficient, with the offensive potential remaining clear, and they'd played these young guns well during the regular season. As Ant had already proven on 2 separate occasions, he rises at this time of year. The man now regularly wearing MJ comparisons gave the vets 31 a game on 51% from the field and 44 from 3 to go with 8 rebounds, 6 assists, and 2 steals. That would have been hard enough to deal with. but damn near the entire team came with him, excelling in their roles and totally dismantling Phoenix, who simply hadn't done the roster work to be competing here. Not only was it a sweep, Ant capped it off as loudly as he possibly could, with the discarded vet openly supporting his antics. Unfortunately for the Cinderella season, round 2 would bring the defending champion Denver Nuggets, who'd been built by the very man who recently transformed this team. Could they actually take what happened barely a year earlier and parlay it? After taking in all the events, they'd done enough to convince me they could truly do it. If ever there were a team built to give Denver fits, it was this one right here. The star power, length, defense, depth, versatility. Why couldn't they do it from an X's and O standpoint? Apparently they shared this sentiment. This fresh roster, who fans were still on the fence about, opened the semifinals by emasculating the defending champions, not very far removed from shaking down another set of established players. As the story normally goes, you lose both your home games, you've probably lost the series. A rule which did not seem to apply to a team led by Jokic, who could apparently just decide to dish out all-time performances. It also helped when Jamal Murray, who wasn't suspended for tossing a heat pack on the floor, seemed healthier after the break between games 2 and 3. What really made it seem lost? Mike Conley would randomly fall out of the pivotal 5th game with a sore Achilles, a diagnosis dangerously capable of sidelining anyone for a series. Without the point guard they specifically traded for, the lineups looked terrible. There wasn't enough spacing, there wasn't enough of a buffer for the Nuggets to not simply double team Ant. After losing 3 straight, it just seemed like the same cold and cruel world they'd always been treated to. Then their alpha told the media he'd see them back there for game 7. A risky move for sure. The same type of tactic Jimmy Butler often employed before failing to execute whatever it is he was talking about. Ant-Man was younger though, more talented, more capable of following through. When it was said and done, the momentumless core had not only trounced the champs in game 6, but overcome a 20-point deficit in game 7 on the road. Absolutely unheard of. Also unheard of? Any real sustained luck or success in Minnesota. This group had done exactly what it needed to for 2024. Proof of concept for the price tag. They'd managed to do the impossible by dethroning what at times appeared to be a flawless team and player. Would it even get any more challenging? Of course it would, by way of the other European absolutely owning the league. Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving unleashed terror upon the jubilant franchise, pretty early on proving to be a matchup nightmare. Ant jumped straight into the Kyrie challenge as he would any, only to find out it was a rock and a hard place. Not only could he not slow Irving down, who else could even defend him when J-Mac was tasked with Luka? After doing some maths, you could form a lineup possibly better equipped to do so, only it would immediately suffer on offense. So Dallas reversed the semifinal script by taking both their home games, ending the second by resparking an age-old conversation about Rudy Gobert. There's no doubting to any consistent watchers what he brings to a team defensively. He elevates them on that side. Also, could you ever win a championship with a guy you have to have on the floor who you can trust with almost nothing offensively? Personally, it was my bigger question. Ant and KAT didn't perform well, but what about those lineups where Rudy and Kyle Anderson are on the floor together? When you can disregard 2/5 of any lineup, are you not at a dire disadvantage playing in playoff games which routinely hinge on a few factors? Either way, those are the questions many faces going forward. It was a hell of a run, way more than enough to justify trying to figure it out with this core. Can they find 1 or 2 more pieces to get them over the top? What if they never do? Rudy is up in 2 more years and will be expensive while heading towards the date. Sure, Naz Reid just signed an extension and he sounds safe, but that extension has a player option for the season after next. It'll certainly be interesting to see where it all goes now. Fans rejoiced as Glenn Taylor prepared to sell the team, only for him to take it back once it became clear the new ownership would cut salaries in 2025. Or so rumor has it. I mean, as I stated earlier, the lineup is expensive, and at this point justified. Ant is going to be getting a $205 million deal through 2029, KAT's $221 million will go through 28, and Rudy's $205 will ring through 2026, while McDaniels gets $131 through 29. It costs to be the boss, which is why I had them as a team who needed to figure it out now. Had they have disappointed and lost 4 straight to Denver, management likely would have been forced to make some tough decisions. Now, they're further in the process than they've ever been. This isn't the story of exactly 2 decades ago, with an aging MVP around an aging supporting cast who just been sent packing by the most dominant forces ever. The job is to take these proven assets and tweak them ever so slightly in an insane conference, seemingly getting more powerful by the year. Oh, also, there's an alien in their backyard ready to reshape the league in his image the minute he gets adequate help. So okay, maybe they are in fact dealing with one of the most dominant forces ever. As a matter of fact, in due time, any up-and-comer in the West will likely have to answer to him. For now though, the 2024 Minnesota Timberwolves are the conference finals runner-ups, and the future is literally as bright as it's ever been. From what you've seen in these style videos, however, team managing is no game. One wrong decision and you can ruin the next decade of basketball in your city. It's tough, but the city is trusting Tim Connolly to do for them what he's done for others.